Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Karl Marzolf. I'm the principal bass player of the Wilmington Symphony Orchestra. I've played the bass now for over 40 years. I started back when I was just in 5th grade and kind of started on a dare from one of my friends and things, and picked up the instrument and just absolutely fell in love with it. You can see it's the largest of the string instruments. In fact, it doesn't even all fit on the screen that you're looking at right now. I tried to get as much of it in here as I could without being too far back so you could still see what I was doing and see what was going on with it. You can notice that just like the other string instruments, it has 4 strings on it. In fact, we tune our instrument very similar to the violin tuning, only backwards. Their smallest string is the E, and our heaviest string down here is the E. And their heaviest string is the G, and our lightest string, our highest string is the G. The string bass is actually much different than some of the other string instruments in the string family in a number of ways. Number one, as I just mentioned, the strings are kind of backwards to the violin. So violin, viola, and cello all tune in fifths. They have 5 notes in between each string, but on string bass we only have 4. Another interesting thing about bass is that we have a lot of different names for our instrument. Depending on the language and depending on kind of just where you come from, you might call this a lot of different instruments. Sometimes you hear it just called a string bass, sometimes a double bass, contrabass, contrabasso. I've even heard up in the mountains it called a bull fiddle from some of the bluegrass bands and things. So this instrument has a lot of history in a lot of different kinds of music. And that's what really attracted me to the instrument, was that in any kind of music that might exist out there, there is always a bass part. And so whether I'm playing something classical, like a solo in the Mahler First Symphony, which is a beautiful solo, or whether I'm playing something more like bluegrass. You can just have a lot of fun with the instrument, playing lots and lots of different styles, even like jazz. Gives you just a wide variety of sounds, whether we're pizzicatoing, playing with the bow. And speaking of the bow, you might notice that mine looks a little larger than what you typically see with violin, viola, or cello. That's because this is a German bow. Bass players actually have to decide fairly early on in their learning whether they're going to play German bow, which has got the larger frog on it here, or a French bow, which looks much more like the violin, viola, and cello bows, only obviously bigger. It has been an age-old debate which is better, the French bow or the German bow. And honestly, it really doesn't matter. You learn how to play one, and that's the one you usually stick with through your whole life. The French bow grip is an overhand grip just like violin, viola, and cello, but with German, we grab it from underneath, which is actually throws back historically all the way into the 1500s and maybe even before that, when they were looking for a large instrument. As string ensembles got larger, they were looking for an instrument that could play an octave below what the cello could play, or at that time what the viols could play, the tenor viol. And it was actually during that period that the bass kind of came on the scene as an instrument that could just put lower notes on, because the bass, we get to play the low notes. That's a really low E, almost at the very end of the piano keyboard. We actually, you'll actually occasionally see modified basses that have 5 strings on them, and that actually adds yet another lower note. Lower string to the bass, B string, which gives us additional notes between that E and the B to play even lower. Takes us all the way to the very end of the piano keyboard. So basses are very different, kind of one from another. Again, if you kind of compare violins and violas, they're all follow pretty much the same pattern, the same design, but basses, you'll see all kinds of different shapes, sizes, colors. There's really not been a standard all the way back into the 1500s when this was related to the viol family, and like I say, kind of got its birth. In fact, a lot of the attributes of the bass, my bass carries, are more related to the viol family than they are to the violin family. The viols preceded the violins by a couple hundred years, and the bass is just sort of carried right on through that period. But sometimes you'll see them with these more rounded corners on them rather than the pokey, sticky out kind like the violins and violas have. This is actually called a viol corner because, again, it looks more like a viol instrument than a violin. And the proportions of the instrument itself, just the ratios of the thickness of the sides versus the length of the top, all those things tend to relate more to the viol family. So we're a little bit of an outsider, I guess, when you talk about strings and things. But it doesn't make any difference what they look like. It's all about how low they can play. And most of what I get to play is accompanimental music, either like I mentioned in jazz or in country or bluegrass, rock and roll styles even occasionally use upright bass. If not, I've got electric basses that I can use for that. But a lot of what I play, especially here in Wilmington, as principal bass player of the Wilmington Symphony, is of course classical music. And classical music typically stays kind of in these lower ranges. It gets about halfway up the neck. So all those notes that I just played, pretty much, a few on either side of that, is the orchestral range for most orchestral music. There are not a lot of solos written for the bass. In fact, most of our solo literature we kind of stole from other instruments. We borrowed from the violins or the cellos and transcribed them down into our octaves so that we were able to play it. But there have been some concertos and some soloistic pieces, and they tend to get really, really high on the fingerboard. So even though this is the majority of what I play is down here, the bass is perfectly capable of going those extra octaves. So the bass is perfectly capable of producing some very high notes and playing way up there in what we call the rosin dust, where the bow and stuff makes contact up here on harmonics, where we're just lightly touching the string and not actually pushing it down, or places where we can actually push down and get some nice vibrato going, those kinds of things. So that's a little bit about my instrument, about string bass. Hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you maybe take the opportunity to go on YouTube and check out some of the other bass players playing these really big concertos and virtuosic pieces that are out there and available. There's also a number of websites dedicated to string bass and particularly orchestral bass, and there's always great articles on there about the instrument, about its history, about how it's made and produced. So should mention too that this one actually is a little over 100 years old now. My bass was built somewhere around 1910. So it's an instrument that's got some age on it, and it still serves me well each year that I go out and play with the symphony and with other groups in the Wilmington area. So hope you've enjoyed this, and you guys have a great day.